I don't know what it is about lighthouses, but whenever I see one, I feel tempted to paint it. And when I saw this reference photo on Instagram account Draw Daily Together, I had to paint it. If you don't know this account, it is run by a few people who share photo references every week. You can draw or paint all of them or just some. I really like seeing how different people capture the same topic with unique approach. I fell in love with this particular photo not only because of the lighthouse, but also because of the grass. It is so long and brushed by the wind in many directions. Looks so fluffy and lovely. I'm painting this with my watercolor set from Roman Szmal in a watercolor sketchbook. I sprayed the watercolors with water at the beginning to activate them. Then I wet the surface of the paper where the sky is. The sky has such a moody vibe in this picture. I didn't make the paper wet evenly, but tried to follow the shapes of the clouds. And to depict the moodiness, I used color named Misty Morning. This is a nice light gray color that granulates with pink and turquoise. It is not very visible on camera, but in person it has subtle color variations. By the way, while painting, I was drinking tea from my handmade toucan mug, and this was so dangerous. If you paint, I'm sure you had accidents where you put your brush into the tea or other beverage. And I almost did it twice during this painting. Luckily, I stopped at the last second and nothing happened, but my hand would just automatically turn the brush into the tea direction. I waited for the sky to dry completely because I didn't want it to blend with the bottom of the painting at all. And for the grass, I made the paper surface wet again for the first layer. Then I used a very light green named Deep Green Gold. It is basically a yellow with green tint as it only contains a yellow pigment. I covered the whole grass surface with it. And then I took Hooker's green and added it to the previous paint to add basic shadows. The color seemed a little bit too mellow, so I wanted to add a tiny bit of phthalo green, but I added too much and it completely overpowered this color mix. I didn't want to waste any paint, so I swept it with my brush and transferred it to the empty space on my palette and created another mix of mostly Hooker's green and some phthalo green. I added this mix loosely to the still wet grass and also as a base layer to the tree behind the lighthouse. This tree is very dark in the reference photo, but I am still using this lightest color as a base. Then I'm adding Pearl Green as the dark layer. I'm adding little spots of color not to cover the whole surface. Paper is still wet, so those dots blend with the previous color. The sketchbook I am using is a hot-pressed paper. I'm not very used to it, and I find it harder to work with than cold-pressed paper. I don't know if it is just me, but hot-pressed one seems to be holding water much worse. Even though it is 100% cotton, it dries very fast. And while working wet on wet, I had to hurry a lot. Even for this small area, the paper got dry very quickly. The rest of the grass was still wet, so I added shadows with Pearl Green as well. I tried to mark the basic shapes that were darker in the photo, but without going into too much details as I'm going to add another layer later. For the grass on the foreground, I planned to add the final details with gouache, so I wasn't focusing on painting every little detail yet. I'm still trying to follow the direction and shape of grass, and I try to keep the light and shadow areas more or less accurate. Some parts of the paper started getting dry, and details that I was adding were more sharp, but that was fine as those were near the lighthouse, so they could be more detailed. I covered a little bit too much with this dark green, so I cleaned my brush from the pigment and wiped some places clean with this damp brush. After this layer dried, it was time for adding more detailed layer. I started with the lighthouse. I already had something that looked grayish-brownish on my palette, so I used it to fill in the roof on the building next to the lighthouse, and on the lighthouse itself. I used the same color for the windows. I should have switched the brush to a smaller one, but did not do that. I find windows the hardest architectural detail on such landscape paintings. They are very difficult for me to paint straight and so that they look realistic and not cartoonish. In this case, the final effect is not the worst, but it is much different than the reference picture, as due to this large brush I painted over some window frame details. The windows on the lighthouse had a lot of small window panes, so I took a tiny brush and basically just painted little dots where the glass was supposed to be. In the picture, there is a lot of dirt on the lighthouse, so I again took a random paint that was already on my palette and had a similar shade. Then I added it with a very small brush using a couple of layers. As you can see, my palette is full of colors and I usually don't clean it after every use, as they can be used again. It would be quite wasteful not to do that. I only try to keep my warm tones on one side and cold tones on the other side, so that warm tones don't get contaminated too much, especially with blue, as they would start to look too dirty. From time to time there is too much pigment and I run out of space and I have to clean the old paint. But if it is not necessary, I always reuse it. And for the last watercolor layer, I took the same paint as before, but this time I'm using less water so it looks darker. I painted some bushes in the middle ground and with the lighter color grass at the front. I tried to follow the grass shape quite accurately. I also darkened some patches and this trail that was going through the middle of the grass field. For the foliage in the background, I used Peruvian green again. I also made the tree behind the lighthouse darker. I used the dots of paint again because I wanted to leave some highlights. There was a big bush on the left, so while painting the background, I made sure not to paint over it, but leave some lighter negative space. Once background was done, I took Hooker's green again and painted shadows on this big bush. The grass field dried almost completely and it was still quite pale, so I went back to this area and darkened some areas. The trail definitely needed to be darker and I spent a lot of time darkening bigger patches of grass, but also adding individual blades of grass. For all of those areas, I used only Hooker's green with different amount of water. After this watercolor layer was done, I took my gouache palette and started adding details to the grass field. Unfortunately, I did not press record and only noticed it when half was already done. I mostly added some individual blades with dark green. It is hard to tell what color this was because I was using paint that was already on my palette for a while and it was a mix of many different colors. So it was an unidentified dark green. For the lighter areas, I tried to mix white with a tiny bit of yellow ochre, but it was barely visible. I guess the background layer was not dark enough. I did add this color mix in a few places nonetheless. For most of the highlights, I used white. I actually only have zinc white, which is a translucent version, so that might explain why I could barely see the mix with yellow. The white itself was also not very visible, to be honest. Probably it would be better to use titanium white, which is opaque. I kept adding more white layers to make each detail more defined. I also added some parts of white mixed with ochre again, and even with yellow, as I felt this white was looking too cold. And this is it, the finished lighthouse. I enjoyed painting it a lot and I love the final effect. Let me know what you think, don't forget to leave a like and see you in the next video. Bye bye!